A private airport runway under scorching midday sun, a luxury jet worth tens of millions sat silent, motionless. The lead engineer shook his head. The pilot shut down the systems. Frustrated, a female billionaire stepped down. Her heels clicked on concrete. An important meeting was waiting. No one dared say there was hope. At the edge of the runway, a struggling mechanic stood quietly. Oil-stained clothes, worn boots. He looked at the engine, listened carefully. He took one step forward. Someone laughed mockingly. And just minutes later, every eye on that runway froze in complete shock. Lucas Meyer was 42 years old, an aircraft mechanic, a single dad raising his 10-year-old son, Noah. Lucas had once been exceptional, one of the top technicians at a major airline. Sharp instincts, steady hands, the kind of mechanic pilots requested by name. But that was 5 years ago, before the accident, before everything fell apart. It hadn't been his fault. A senior engineer had signed off on a repair Lucas had flagged as incomplete. Lucas had documented his concerns, filed the paperwork, followed protocol. But when the aircraft developed problems mid-flight, someone needed to take the blame. And Lucas was the easiest target, not senior enough to fight back, not connected enough to be protected. The airline terminated him quietly. No public announcement, no explanation. Just a severance check and a file that had been quietly marked in the industry database. After that, no major carrier would hire him. His resume went into black holes. His calls went unreturned. The whisper network in aviation was small and efficient. Once you were marked, you stayed marked. So Lucas survived on contract work, temporary gigs, fill-in positions, jobs that paid cash and asked few questions. He fixed small planes at regional airports, worked overnight shifts at cargo facilities, did whatever kept food on the table, and paid Noah's school fees. Today, he'd been hired for auxiliary work at a private airport, the kind of place where corporate jets landed, where the wealthy came and went without ever seeing people like him. His job was simple: stay in the maintenance area, handle basic tasks, don't interact with clients, don't approach the premium aircraft. Lucas understood the rules. He wore his old uniform, the one from his previous job with the patches removed. The sleeves were patched, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. He looked exactly like what he was, someone who'd been pushed to the margins. The other mechanics barely acknowledged him. The lead engineers didn't bother learning his name. He was just temporary labor, invisible. That's how he preferred it anyway. Less attention meant fewer questions. Lucas was checking inventory in the maintenance shed when he heard the commotion. Raised voices on the runway, the distinct sound of a jet engine that wouldn't turn over. He walked to the edge of the restricted area, stayed behind the yellow line, watched from a distance. A sleek corporate jet sat on the tarmac, brand new by the look of it. Gulfstream G650, top of the line, $50 million easy. The boarding stairs were down. A woman stood at the bottom, mid-40s, impeccably dressed, designer suit, heels that cost more than Lucas made in a month. Even from a distance, he could see the anger in her posture. Evelyn Cross. Lucas recognized her from business news, CEO of a multinational investment firm, known for hostile takeovers and ruthless efficiency. She'd just purchased this jet last month. It had been all over the aviation trade publications. The lead engineer was gesturing, explaining something. Evelyn wasn't listening. She was looking at her watch, making calls. Her body language screamed urgency. Lucas could see the pilot in the cockpit, running through restart procedures. Nothing. The engine stayed silent. The lead engineer opened an access panel, checked connections, ran diagnostics on a tablet, shook his head. From where Lucas stood, he could hear fragments of conversation. System failure, unknown cause. Need to bring in specialists, could take hours, maybe days. Evelyn's voice carried across the tarmac, sharp, demanding. I have a board meeting in 3 hours, in another city. This is unacceptable. The engineer had no good answers. His team huddled, checking manuals, making calls, looking increasingly desperate. Lucas watched, listened, and then he heard it. A sound so faint most people would miss it. A slight irregularity in the auxiliary power unit. Not the main engines, something smaller. Something in the startup sequence. He'd heard that sound before, years ago, on a different aircraft, a different problem that presented the same symptom. Lucas knew what it was, knew how to fix it, but he also knew his place. He was auxiliary staff. He wasn't authorized to approach premium aircraft, wasn't supposed to offer opinions, wasn't supposed to exist beyond his assigned duties. He should stay quiet, stay invisible, do his job and go home. But that sound, that specific frequency, it meant something. And if he was right, the fix was simple. 30 seconds, maybe less. Lucas looked at the jet, looked at Evelyn pacing, looked at the engineers scratching their heads. He thought about Noah, about the rent due next week, about the careful balance of staying employed while staying invisible. Then he thought about what his father had taught him before he died, before Lucas became a single parent, before everything got complicated. If you can fix it, fix it. The rest is just noise. Lucas took a breath, stepped across the yellow line, and walked toward $50 million worth of grounded aircraft, toward a billionaire who had no idea who he was, toward engineers who would see him as an intruder, his boots scuffed against concrete, his uniform shabby against the gleaming jet. And every step felt like walking toward either salvation or disaster. He just wasn't sure which. The lead engineer saw Lucas first. His expression shifted from confusion to irritation in half a second. "Excuse me, this is a restricted area." Lucas stopped a few feet from the jet, kept his voice respectful. Neutral. "I know. I heard the engine. I think I might know what's wrong." The engineer's eyebrows rose, almost amused. "You think you know?" It wasn't a question. It was dismissal wrapped in politeness. Another engineer turned around, looked Lucas up and down, took in the patched uniform, the oil stains, the worn boots. "Who are you?" the second engineer asked. "Lucas Meyer. I'm auxiliary maintenance. I was hired for auxiliary." The first engineer cut him off. "So you're here to change light bulbs and sweep hangars." Lucas felt the heat rise in his face, but he kept his voice level. "I'm a certified aircraft mechanic. I have experience with this model, and I think the problem is in the APU starter relay." The second engineer laughed, actually laughed. "The APU? We've already checked that. This is a fuel system issue, way above your pay grade." Lucas shook his head slowly. "It's not fuel. If it was fuel, you'd see different indicators. The sound it's making suggests..." "The sound?" The first engineer's tone was openly mocking now. "You're diagnosing a $50 million aircraft by sound?" "Yes," Lucas said simply, "because that's how you catch things the diagnostics miss." A third engineer had joined them, older, more senior. He looked at Lucas with something between pity and contempt. "Son, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but this isn't a prop plane. This is precision engineering. We have computer systems, diagnostic equipment, factory-certified protocols." He gestured at his tablet. "We don't fix things by ear anymore." Lucas wanted to argue, wanted to explain that computers only told you what they were programmed to detect. That experience and instinct still mattered. That some sounds meant specific things no diagnostic could catch. But he could see it was pointless. These men had already decided who he was, what he was worth, and it was nothing. Evelyn had been on her phone, but now she was walking toward them, her heels sharp against the tarmac. She looked at Lucas. Her gaze was cold, assessing. "What's happening here?" The lead engineer straightened slightly, respectful. "Nothing, Ms. Cross. Just some auxiliary staff who thought he could help." The way he said auxiliary staff made it sound like an insult. Evelyn looked at Lucas, really looked at him, and Lucas saw exactly what she saw. A man in a shabby uniform, someone who didn't belong anywhere near her aircraft, someone beneath notice. "Can you fix this?" she asked. Her tone made it clear she expected the answer to be no. "I believe I can," Lucas said, "if you give me 60 seconds to check one component." One of the engineers scoffed. Ms. Cross, I strongly advise against this. We have protocols. We can't just let random maintenance workers— I'm not random, Lucas interrupted quietly. I have 12 years of experience. I was lead mechanic at— Was, the older engineer emphasized, past tense, which makes me wonder why you're working auxiliary maintenance now instead of with a major carrier. The implication hung in the air. If Lucas was any good, he'd still be with a real airline. The fact that he wasn't said everything anyone needed to know. Lucas felt the shame burn through him, the truth he couldn't defend against, the past he couldn't explain without making everything worse. Evelyn checked her watch. Her jaw tightened. How long will it take to get factory technicians here? The lead engineer consulted his tablet. Minimum 4 hours, possibly longer depending on their schedule. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Lucas could see her calculating. Missing the meeting, the cost, the consequences. 60 seconds, Lucas said again. That's all I'm asking. If I'm wrong, you've lost nothing. If I'm right, you make your meeting. Evelyn looked at him, then at her engineers, then back at Lucas. You touch my aircraft and make things worse, I'll make sure you never work in aviation again. Lucas almost laughed. Almost said he was already there. Already at the bottom. Already blacklisted. What more could she do? But he just nodded. Understood. Evelyn gestured impatiently. 60 seconds. Not 61. Lucas moved quickly. He didn't need tools, didn't need to open major panels. He walked to a specific access point near the tail. Small, easy to overlook. He knelt down, put his ear against the housing, listened. There. That sound. Exactly what he thought. He reached in, found the starter relay, felt the connection. Loose, not broken, not burned out, just loose. Probably vibrated free during transport. The kind of thing that happened. The kind of thing diagnostics wouldn't catch because technically everything was connected. Just not well enough. Lucas pressed it firmly back into place, heard the satisfying click, stood up, dusted off his knees. Try it now, he said. The engineers looked at each other, skeptical, annoyed. The lead engineer nodded to the pilot. Restart sequence. The pilot, visible through the cockpit window, ran through the startup. For a moment, nothing. Then the APU hummed to life. Smooth. Perfect. The main engines followed. The whine of turbines spinning up. All systems green. The entire runway went silent. Not the silence of malfunction, the silence of shock. Every engineer stared. Evelyn stared. Even the pilot looked stunned. Lucas stood there, hands at his sides, shabby uniform, oil stains, and a $50 million jet running perfectly behind him. For a long moment, nobody moved. The jet engines hummed. Perfect pitch, perfect rhythm. Everything the diagnostics said was impossible. The lead engineer looked at his tablet, then at the jet, then back at his tablet. His face had gone pale. That's not possible, he muttered. We checked that connection. It was secure. Lucas said nothing, just stood there, waiting. The second engineer walked over to the access panel, looked inside, saw exactly what Lucas had fixed. A simple, loose connection, something a first-year student could have caught, if they'd been listening, if they'd known what to listen for. How did you know? The second engineer asked. His voice had lost its mocking edge. Lucas shrugged slightly. Experience. I've seen this before. The sound is distinctive. Diagnostics won't flag it because the circuit is technically complete, just not tight enough to maintain proper voltage under startup load. The older engineer was shaking his head, not in disagreement, in disbelief. 12 years, you said. Where did you work before? And there it was. The question Lucas had been dreading. The question that would end this moment of validation as quickly as it had begun. Skyward Airlines, Lucas said quietly. I was lead mechanic for their regional fleet. Recognition flickered across the older engineer's face. Then something else. Realization. Meyer. Lucas Meyer. The man's expression shifted. You're the one from the Denver incident. Lucas felt his stomach drop. Yes. The temperature on the runway seemed to drop 10 degrees. The other engineers were looking at each other, whispering. The Denver incident. Everyone in aviation knew about it, or thought they did. Evelyn stepped forward. Her expression had changed. No longer impatient, now curious. What incident? The older engineer hesitated, then spoke. 5 years ago, Skyward Flight 447, emergency landing due to hydraulic failure. Significant damage to the aircraft. No injuries, but the airline grounded their fleet for inspection. He looked at Lucas. Mr. Meyer was terminated immediately after. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Why? Lucas took a breath. This was it. The moment where his credibility evaporated, where the skill he'd just demonstrated became irrelevant. Because I was the mechanic who signed off on that aircraft's last inspection, Lucas said. His voice was steady. And when the hydraulic system failed, someone needed to be held accountable. But it wasn't your fault, a new voice said. Everyone turned. The airport manager was walking toward them. She was holding a tablet. Her expression was serious. I just pulled up the incident report. The full one, not the public summary. She looked at Lucas. You filed a maintenance discrepancy report 3 days before that flight, flagged a potential issue with the hydraulic reservoir seal, requested additional inspection before the aircraft returned to service. Lucas said nothing. He learned years ago that defending himself only made things worse. The manager continued, reading from her tablet. Your supervisor, a senior engineer named Robert Kellerman, overruled your recommendation, said the aircraft was airworthy, signed off on it himself. And when the seal failed mid-flight, the airline blamed the last mechanic in the chain of responsibility. She looked up. You. They blamed you, even though you documented the exact problem that caused the failure. The silence on the runway was deafening. Evelyn's expression had gone cold, but not toward Lucas. Where is this supervisor now? She asked. The manager checked her tablet. Promoted. He's currently director of maintenance for Skyward's entire western region. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Lucas could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was a CEO. She understood office politics, understood scapegoating, understood how organizations protected their own at the expense of the disposable. Mr. Meyer, Evelyn said. Her tone had completely changed. Why didn't you fight this? Why didn't you go public? Lucas looked at her. Really looked at her. Because I had a 6-year-old son, and fighting would have meant lawyers I couldn't afford, media attention that would have followed me forever. And even if I won, which was unlikely, I'd be marked as troublesome. No airline would touch me. He paused. At least this way, I could still work. Under the radar. Enough to keep my son fed and housed. Evelyn absorbed that. The brutal calculus of survival. The choice between vindication and subsistence. So you let them destroy your career, she said, to protect your son. Yes. Lucas's voice was quiet. I'd do it again. The lead engineer who'd mocked Lucas earlier looked sick. I owe you an apology, a serious one. Lucas nodded. Accepted. But the older engineer wasn't done. He was looking at Lucas with something like awe. You diagnosed this problem in 30 seconds. Something our entire team missed with diagnostic computers and factory training, because you listened, because you have experience we don't teach anymore. He gestured at the younger engineers. These men learn from manuals and computer models. They've never learned to trust their instincts, to hear what a machine is telling them. He looked at Evelyn. Ms. Cross, if you're smart, you'll hire this man. Today. Now. Before someone else realizes what just happened here. Evelyn was already pulling out her phone. What's your current salary, Mr. Meyer? Lucas hesitated. I make about $40,000 a year. Contract work. No benefits. Evelyn didn't even blink. I'll triple it. Plus benefits. Plus a signing bonus equivalent to a year's salary. You'll be my personal aircraft maintenance consultant. You'll inspect every aircraft I own, train my mechanics, and you'll have complete authority to ground any aircraft you deem unsafe. Lucas stared at her. Ms. Cross, I appreciate the offer, but... No buts, Evelyn interrupted. I just watched you fix in 60 seconds what these men couldn't fix in an hour. You did it with experience and instinct and skill that can't be taught from a manual. That's worth more than money. That's worth protecting. She paused. And more importantly, you put your son first when the world tried to break you. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Lucas felt something crack inside his chest. 5 years of carrying shame. 5 years of working in shadows. 5 years of being invisible. And in 60 seconds, it all shifted. I have one condition, Lucas said. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Name it. The system that blacklisted me is still there, still destroying people who do the right thing. I want you to help me expose what happened. Not for revenge, but so it doesn't happen to someone else. Evelyn smiled, a real smile. Mr. Meyer, I take apart corrupt systems for a living. It's what I do best. Consider it done. She extended her hand. Lucas shook it. And on that runway under the midday sun, everything changed. Not because of money, not because of revenge, but because one man listened when everyone else was reading diagnostics. And sometimes that's all it takes. Evelyn didn't board the jet immediately. She made 3 phone calls right there on the runway. The first was to her legal team. I need you to pull every document related to Skyward Airlines Flight 447, the incident from 5 years ago, every maintenance record, every internal memo, everything. She paused, listening. I don't care if it's sealed. Find a way. We have 48 hours. The second call was to her head of corporate security. I need a background check. Robert Kellerman, currently director of maintenance at Skyward. I want to know every decision he's made in the last 5 years, every aircraft incident, every complaint filed against him. The third call was to her chief of staff. Cancel my afternoon, reschedule the board meeting. This is more important. Lucas stood off to the side, watching. The engineers had dispersed, some looking ashamed, others thoughtful. The older engineer approached Lucas, extended his hand. I'm sorry, he said, for assuming, or for dismissing you. That was unprofessional. Lucas shook his hand. You didn't know. I should have asked, the man replied. Instead of judging, that's on me. He paused. For what it's worth, what you did today was remarkable. I've been in this industry 30 years. I've never seen anyone diagnose a problem that fast, that accurately. Lucas nodded, accepting the compliment, the praise, something he hadn't heard in 5 years. Evelyn finished her calls, walked back to Lucas. I'm going to make this right, she said, not just for you, for everyone who got crushed by that system. Lucas felt something unfamiliar, hope, but also caution. Mrs. Cross, I appreciate what you're doing, but I need you to understand something. Evelyn waited. I don't want revenge, Lucas said. I don't want Robert Kellerman fired or humiliated. I don't want a public spectacle. Evelyn frowned slightly, confused. Then what do you want? Lucas chose his words carefully. I want the truth documented. I want the industry to know what happened, so the next mechanic who flags a safety concern doesn't get thrown away for doing the right thing. He paused. But Kellerman, he's made his choices. He has to live with them. That's punishment enough. Evelyn studied him. Most people in your position would want blood. I'm not most people, Lucas said. I learned something these past 5 years. Anger is expensive, revenge is exhausting, and neither one puts food on my son's table or keeps him safe at night. He looked at the jet behind them, still running perfectly. I fixed that engine because it needed fixing, not to prove anything, not to humiliate anyone, just because it was broken and I knew how to make it right. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. You're right. And you're better than I would be in your situation. She pulled out her phone again, made another call. Change of plans. I don't want a lawsuit. I want a safety audit, industry-wide. Anonymous reporting system for mechanics who identify safety concerns, and I want it funded properly. I'll put up the initial capital. She listened. Yes, I'm serious. Make it happen. She hung up, looked at Lucas. Better? Better, Lucas agreed. Evelyn smiled. You know what the real power is, Mr. Meyer. It's not destroying the people who wronged you. It's fixing the system so they can't wrong anyone else. Lucas felt something shift. A weight he'd been carrying for 5 years, not gone, but lighter. When do I start? He asked. Evelyn checked her watch. Can you start Monday? I need you to inspect my fleet. All 5 aircraft, top to bottom. I want to know everything that's wrong, everything that could go wrong. I want the truth, even if it's expensive. Lucas thought about it. 3 days to arrange things, to tell Noah, to process what had just happened. Monday works, he said. Evelyn extended her hand again. Welcome aboard, Mr. Meyer, and thank you for fixing my jet, for teaching my engineers a lesson in humility, and for showing me what real integrity looks like. Lucas shook her hand, then walked back across the runway, past the yellow line, back to where he'd started the day. Except everything was different now. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't disposable. He was seen, valued, respected. Not because he'd demanded it, not because he'd fought for it, but because he'd done what he'd always done. Listen, fix what was broken, and let his work speak for itself. Lucas drove home in his old truck, the same truck he'd driven that morning, but everything felt different. Lighter. He pulled into the driveway of his small rental house. Noah was on the porch, waiting, like he did every day. The boy ran to him. "Dad, you're early!" Lucas picked him up, hugged him tight. "I had a good day, buddy." Noah pulled back, looked at his father's face. "What happened?" Lucas smiled. "I fixed something important." They went inside. Lucas made dinner, spaghetti, Noah's favorite. While the water boiled, Noah did his homework at the kitchen table. Lucas watched him. This boy who'd kept him going through 5 years of darkness, who'd never complained when they ate ramen for a week, who'd never asked why Dad worked so many odd jobs, who'd never questioned why they couldn't afford the things his friends had. "Dad?" Noah looked up from his math worksheet. "Yeah, buddy? Did someone finally notice you're really good at fixing things?" Lucas's throat tightened. "Yeah, someone did." Noah grinned. "Good, because you are. You fix everything." Not everything, Lucas thought, but enough. Over dinner, Lucas told Noah about the job, about the billionaire's jet, about starting Monday. He kept it simple, age-appropriate, but Noah understood. His dad had been given a chance, a real one. "Does this mean we can stay in this house?" Noah asked. They'd been month to month for 2 years, always one bad month away from moving again. "Yeah," Lucas said. "We can stay. We can even look for something bigger, maybe with a yard." Noah's eyes went wide. "Can we get a dog?" Lucas laughed. "Maybe. We'll see." That night after Noah went to bed, Lucas sat on the porch, looking at the stars, thinking about the sound, that tiny irregularity in the APU, so small most people wouldn't notice. But he had, because he'd learned to listen, not just with his ears, but with his experience, his instinct, the things you couldn't teach from a manual. 3 weeks later, Lucas stood in a hangar. Evelyn's entire maintenance team assembled. He was training them, not from textbooks, from experience. "Computers will tell you what's wrong," Lucas said, "but only if they're programmed to recognize it. Your job is to catch what the computers miss, and you do that by listening, by paying attention, by trusting your instincts." A young mechanic raised his hand. "How do we know when to trust our instincts?" Lucas thought about it. When something feels wrong, it usually is. Don't ignore that feeling. Document it. Report it. Even if you're wrong, especially if you're wrong. Because being wrong is free, but being silent when you're right can cost lives. The room was quiet. These young mechanics were listening. Really listening. And Lucas realized something. This was why he'd survived 5 years in the wilderness. Not for revenge, not for vindication, but for this moment, where he could teach the next generation to do it right, where he could fix the system that had broken him. Evelyn watched from the back of the hangar, smiled. She'd made the right call. 6 months later, the industry-wide safety reporting system launched. Anonymous, protected, funded. In the first month, it received over 300 reports, issues that had been quietly ignored, problems that mechanics were afraid to flag, things that could have become disasters. And every report was investigated, every concern addressed. The system was changing, not because of lawsuits, not because of revenge, but because one mechanic had listened when everyone else was reading diagnostics. Because one billionaire had the humility to recognize skill over status. Because sometimes the quietest voice has the most important thing to say. Lucas still drove the same old truck, still lived modestly, still put Noah first in every decision, but now he did it with security, with dignity, with the knowledge that his work mattered, that he mattered. And every time he heard an engine, he listened, not just for problems, but for the sound of things working right, the sound of things being fixed, the sound that had changed everything. If this story moved you, subscribe to Daddy Healing Stories for more powerful tales about fathers who sacrifice, persevere, and never give up. These are stories about quiet strength, about choosing family over pride, about men who fix what's broken without seeking glory. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications, because every father's struggle deserves to be heard. Every sacrifice deserves to be honored, and every quiet hero deserves to be seen.